I thought the most expensive mistake of my life would be delivering flowers to the wrong ballroom, but I was wrong. The real mistake belonged to the most feared man in New York, and before the night was over, every powerful person in that glittering room would remember my face. Rain whispered against the towering glass windows of the Grand Astoria Hotel, turning the Manhattan skyline into a watercolor of silver lights and blurred shadows. My delivery van smelled like fresh roses, eucalyptus, and the vanilla coffee I'd forgotten to finish during the 40-minute drive from Brooklyn. At 26, I owned the smallest flower shop on my block, and every bouquet I carried felt like another chance to keep the business alive for one more month. Rent was due in 4 days. My refrigerator held little more than yogurt and orange juice. My savings account looked like a bad joke. Still, flowers had always made impossible days feel a little softer, so I kept believing tomorrow would somehow be kinder than today. I adjusted the black dress I wore beneath my delivery jacket and carefully lifted the enormous arrangement waiting in the back of the van. White orchids, ivory roses, baby's breath, Italian olive branches woven into a perfect circle around a velvet ring pillow. Whoever ordered this arrangement had spent more money on flowers than I usually earned in 3 weeks. A young event coordinator hurried toward me the second I stepped inside the marble lobby. "You're late," she whispered, though I still had 12 minutes before the scheduled delivery. "The ceremony is about to begin. Follow me." Before I could explain that traffic on Fifth Avenue had barely moved because of the rain, she had already disappeared through a pair of golden doors. I hurried after her, balancing nearly 40 pounds of flowers with both hands. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead like frozen constellations. A string quartet played softly beneath conversations dressed in million-dollar smiles. Diamonds flashed beneath warm lights. Tailored tuxedos drifted between champagne towers. Every guest looked as though they belonged on the cover of a luxury magazine. I absolutely did not. "Over here," the coordinator hissed, pointing toward the center aisle before vanishing again. I took another careful step. Then another. My shoes barely made a sound against the polished marble floor. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the grand staircase where a tall man descended with measured confidence. He looked no older than 32. Black tailored suit, white shirt open at the collar, calm gray eyes that seemed incapable of uncertainty. Even from across the ballroom, authority surrounded him like invisible gravity. People instinctively moved aside without being asked. Respect followed him. So did silence. I noticed the ink before anything else. A dark pattern climbed above his collar and disappeared beneath expensive fabric, hinting at tattoos that continued far beyond what anyone could see. Someone near me whispered his name so quietly it barely reached my ears. Damien Moretti. Every conversation stopped. Every musician lowered their instruments. The entire ballroom seemed to inhale together. I realized then this wasn't an engagement party. It wasn't simply another society wedding. This was the public announcement of an alliance between two families powerful enough to make politicians smile and billionaires wait their turn. I should have delivered the flowers and walked away. Instead, the event coordinator suddenly grabbed my elbow from behind. "Stand here," she whispered. Before I could protest, she disappeared into the crowd again. I found myself standing exactly where someone else had apparently been moments earlier, still holding the floral arrangement with the velvet ring pillow resting perfectly on top. Damien climbed the final step and stopped directly in front of me. His expression never changed. Neither did mine, mostly because confusion had completely replaced thought. He reached toward the pillow without hesitation, lifted the platinum ring, and looked straight into my eyes. The ballroom held its breath. Cameras flashed. My pulse thundered inside my ears. Then, with absolute certainty, Damien Moretti gently took my trembling left hand and slipped the ring onto my finger. Gasps echoed across the room. Someone dropped a champagne glass. I stared at the diamond catching the chandelier light before lifting my eyes back to his. For 3 endless seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I slowly removed the ring, placed it back onto the velvet pillow between us, met the gaze of the most powerful man in the room, and quietly said, "Mr. Moretti, I think you just proposed to the wrong woman." Nobody moved. It was astonishing how a room filled with nearly 300 influential guests could become quieter than a library simply because one woman had returned a ring instead of keeping it. I could hear the faint tapping of rain against the towering windows again. I could hear my own heartbeat. Even the string quartet had forgotten to breathe. Damien Moretti looked at the velvet pillow resting between us, then at my empty hand. His expression did not crack. If anything, it became calmer, and somehow that was even more unsettling. The photographers lowered their cameras without being told. Several men wearing perfectly tailored black suits appeared near the edges of the ballroom, not rushing, not threatening, simply positioning themselves with practiced precision. Their movements were so smooth that most guests probably never noticed them. I swallowed and reminded myself that flowers did not deliver themselves. I had a shop waiting for me in Brooklyn, unpaid invoices sitting on my kitchen counter, and a cat named Maple who would certainly complain if I came home late again. This was not my world. It never would be. I gently set the floral arrangement onto the nearby display table and took one careful step backward. "Thank you," I said as politely as I could. "I believe my delivery is complete." I turned toward the exit before anyone answered. "Miss Carter." His voice was low, controlled, almost effortless. It was not loud, yet it stopped me more effectively than anyone shouting my name ever could. I looked back over my shoulder. "Please wait." It sounded less like a request than simple confidence that I would. Still, there was no anger in his tone, only certainty. I faced him again, folding my hands together so he would not notice they had begun trembling. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," I said. "I am Olivia Carter. I own Carter Florals. Someone asked me to stand here, and I assumed I was delivering the flowers." A murmur spread through the ballroom like wind moving across water. Damien studied my face for several long seconds. His gray eyes were sharp but strangely unreadable, as though they were searching for an answer that had nothing to do with my words. Finally, he glanced toward an older gentleman standing several feet away. "Where is Victoria?" he asked quietly. The older man froze. His face drained of color before he answered. "She was here less than a minute ago." Damien said nothing. Silence settled over the room again, heavier this time. He slowly turned his attention back to me. "Miss Carter," he said, "did anyone instruct you to stand exactly where you were standing?" I nodded. The event coordinator pointed me there. She seemed to be in a hurry. "Can you identify her?" I looked around the ballroom. Guests whispered behind champagne glasses. Some avoided looking at us entirely. Others stared openly, eager for the next unexpected moment. The coordinator who had rushed me inside had vanished completely. "No," I admitted. "She is gone." Damien's gaze drifted briefly toward the grand entrance before returning to mine. Something changed behind his calm expression. Not panic, not frustration, calculation. He was assembling invisible pieces that nobody else could even see. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. It was small and almost impossible to notice, but it transformed the entire room because everyone else seemed startled by it. "You have remarkable composure," he said. I laughed softly before I could stop myself. "That is because I am trying very hard not to faint." A few guests actually smiled. Even one of the men in black suits lowered his eyes to hide an amused expression. Damien stepped closer, leaving a respectful distance between us. Up close, I noticed the intricate black tattoos rising from beneath his collar and disappearing beneath his sleeves, each line disappearing under expensive fabric like pieces of a hidden story. His cologne carried subtle notes of cedarwood and bergamot instead of the overpowering scent I expected. "Most people would have kept the ring," he said. "Most people probably have better jewelry collections than I do," I replied. "Besides, if something is not mine, I cannot pretend it is." He held my gaze a moment longer before giving a nearly invisible nod. Around us, conversations remained suspended, waiting for his next decision. Instead of addressing the crowd, he looked directly at me and asked, "Miss Carter, before you leave, would you allow me 10 minutes to understand why the wrong woman was standing exactly where the right woman was supposed to be?" For a brief moment, I considered refusing. 10 minutes in a room filled with strangers who wore custom suits worth more than my delivery then sounded like the beginning of every bad decision a practical woman could make. Yet something in Damien Moretti's voice was different from what I had expected. There was authority, certainly, confidence that seemed carved into him like stone. But beneath it, I heard genuine curiosity. He was not asking because his pride had been bruised. He was asking because something about tonight did not make sense to him. I took a slow breath and glanced toward the ballroom doors. Rain still shimmered against the glass outside, turning the city into scattered ribbons of silver. 10 minutes, I answered. After that I have to get back to my shop. Flowers do not water themselves. A faint smile appeared again. Fair enough. He turned slightly toward the older gentleman beside him. Anthony, please thank our guests for their patience. Tell them tonight's celebration will continue shortly. Anthony nodded immediately and stepped toward the center of the ballroom with effortless professionalism. Within seconds, musicians resumed playing soft classical music. Servers began moving with trays of sparkling water and champagne, and conversation slowly returned, although everyone continued watching Damien and me from the corners of their eyes. It was impossible not to notice. I followed Damien toward a quieter gallery overlooking Central Park. The room was lined with paintings older than my grandparents and illuminated by warm amber lights that softened the rain outside. The silence here felt peaceful instead of tense. He waited until the doors closed before speaking again. Tell me exactly what happened from the moment you arrived. I explained everything. The traffic, the event coordinator rushing me inside, the instructions to stand beneath the staircase, the enormous flower arrangement. Every detail I could remember. Damien listened without interrupting once. When I finished, he remained thoughtful for several seconds before walking toward the nearby table where Anthony had quietly placed the velvet ring pillow. The platinum ring rested exactly where I had returned it. Damien studied it without touching it. This ring has belonged to my family for generations, he said calmly. Tonight was supposed to symbolize trust between two respected families. Instead, someone redirected the ceremony before it even began. I folded my arms gently. You think someone planned this? I never believe in impossible coincidences. His answer came instantly. He looked toward Anthony. Review every guest arrival, every staff member, every vendor, especially the event coordinator. Anthony nodded once. Already being done. I blinked. That was fast. Anthony allowed himself the smallest smile. Mr. Moretti prefers solving questions before they become problems. Damien finally picked up the ring, turning it beneath the warm light. The diamond reflected tiny stars across the polished wood table. Miss Carter, he asked quietly, have we ever met before tonight? No. Have you ever worked for my family? No. Do you know anyone named Victoria Sinclair? I shook my head. I have never heard that name until 5 minutes ago. He nodded as though confirming something only he understood. Nothing about his questions felt random. They felt precise, almost mathematical. I noticed his eyes drifting toward the bouquet I had created. You arranged these flowers yourself? Every stem. Why white orchids? I smiled despite myself. Because orchids survive longer than most people expect. They look delicate, but they are surprisingly resilient. Damien looked at the arrangement for another long moment before saying quietly, interesting. What is? I asked. That is exactly what my grandmother used to say. An unexpected chill traveled across my shoulders. I had never met his grandmother. I had never met anyone in his family. Yet somehow the same sentence had connected two complete strangers standing in the middle of an impossible evening. Before I could ask another question, Anthony's phone vibrated. He read the screen, and for the first time that night his composed expression shifted. He looked directly at Damien and said, Sir, we found the event coordinator. According to hotel records, nobody by that name has ever worked here. Anthony's words settled over the room with a strange weight that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with impossibility. I looked from him to Damien, expecting someone to explain that there had been a misunderstanding, that the hotel database was outdated, or that another employee simply used the wrong name. Nobody spoke. Damien remained perfectly still, the platinum ring resting between his fingers as though he had forgotten it was there. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rain continued falling over Central Park, each drop catching the city lights before disappearing into darkness. Finally, Damien placed the ring back onto the velvet pillow with deliberate care. Show me everything, he said quietly. Anthony unlocked his tablet within seconds and opened the hotel's security timeline. I stepped closer, mostly because curiosity had already defeated common sense. Camera after camera displayed different parts of the ballroom. Guests arriving beneath crystal chandeliers, caterers carrying silver trays, musicians tuning their instruments, florists wheeling arrangements through service elevators. Then Anthony stopped at the footage showing me entering the lobby carrying the enormous bouquet. There, I whispered. That is her. A woman wearing a black headset hurried toward me on the screen, speaking with animated gestures before directing me toward the ballroom. Anthony enlarged the image. The resolution sharpened. My stomach tightened. The woman wore an event badge, but where her name should have appeared, the plastic holder reflected only white light. Anthony switched to another camera angle taken 15 seconds. Later, the hallway was empty. I frowned. She was just there. He nodded once. She disappeared between cameras. That is impossible. Damien answered without looking away from the screen. Tonight has already proven impossible is an unreliable word. Anthony opened the staff roster provided by the hotel. More than 100 employees had worked the event. Every photograph matched a name. Every contractor had identification records. Every temporary vendor had been registered 48 hours in advance. There was no trace of the woman who had redirected me. My practical side searched desperately for an ordinary explanation. Maybe she had borrowed someone else's badge. Maybe she had left before check-in. Maybe the cameras missed something. Yet none of those possibilities explained why Damien appeared less surprised than concerned. He looked toward me. "Miss Carter, has anything unusual happened to you recently? Anyone asking strange questions? Following your shop? Ordering flowers without collecting them?" I shook my head slowly. Business has actually been slow. Most of my customers are neighborhood families planning birthdays, anniversaries, or church events. Nobody important even knows who I am. He studied me carefully before saying, "Someone new enough to place you exactly where you needed to stand." Those words echoed louder than the orchestra playing beyond the gallery walls. I wrapped my arms around myself without realizing it. You keep saying needed. Because accidents rarely arrive wearing perfect timing. Anthony's tablet chimed again. A new report appeared on the screen. "Sir, security has completed facial recognition from the lobby cameras." "And?" Damien asked. Anthony looked genuinely puzzled. "The software identified every guest except one." He slowly turned the tablet toward us. The highlighted image showed me standing beside the mysterious coordinator. My own face was outlined in green. The space where the woman's face should have been remained completely blank, as though the program refused to recognize that anyone had been standing there at all. I leaned closer until my reflection mixed with the image on the screen. "That cannot be real," I whispered. Anthony quietly replied. Every other face was identified within 2 seconds. Damien looked from the tablet to the bouquet I had designed with white orchids woven around olive branches. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion toward me, but toward the puzzle unfolding piece by piece. Then he asked a question so unexpected that it sent another chill through me. "Olivia, do you happen to know where you were born?" I blinked twice before answering because the question seemed too ordinary after everything that had happened. "Boston," I said. "At least that is what I have always been told." Damien did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched my face with the same quiet focus he had given every detail since I walked into the ballroom. "You are not certain," he observed. I let out a nervous laugh. "Most people do not question their birth certificate." He nodded once. "And your parents?" My smile softened. "They passed away when I was 16. A car accident during a snowstorm. After that I finished high school, worked every job I could find, and eventually opened my flower shop." Saying it out loud still carried the familiar ache of old memories. My parents had never been wealthy. They had simply been kind people who believed every problem could be solved with enough patience and fresh coffee. Damien lowered his eyes for a moment before asking another question. "Did they ever speak about your childhood before Boston?" "No. We never talked much about those early years. I assumed there was nothing interesting to tell." Anthony quietly placed another document on the polished table. "Sir, this arrived from our archives." Damien looked down. It was an old photograph sealed inside a protective sleeve. The edges had faded with time, but the image remained surprisingly clear. An elderly woman stood beside a greenhouse overflowing with white orchids. Around her neck rested a silver pendant shaped like an olive branch. I smiled without thinking. "She looks kind." Damien glanced toward me. She was my grandmother. I looked closer. The greenhouse behind her looked strangely familiar. Rows of orchids stretched toward tall windows flooded with morning light. "My parents used to take me somewhere that looked like this," I whispered, "when I was very little." The memory appeared without warning, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. Warm glass walls. The smell of damp soil. Someone laughing as I carried a tiny watering can almost bigger than my arms. I closed my eyes, trying to catch more of the memory before it disappeared. I always thought I imagined it. Damien leaned forward slightly. What else do you remember? I pressed my fingers gently against my temple. Not much. There was music. Wind chimes, maybe. And I hesitated. Someone called me Little Sparrow. Anthony and Damien exchanged a glance, so brief most people would have missed it. I noticed. What? I asked. Anthony answered carefully. Mr. Moretti's grandmother called only one person by that nickname. A strange silence settled over the gallery again. Who? I whispered. Damien looked directly into my eyes. A little girl who disappeared 22 years ago. My heartbeat stumbled. That cannot be me. I agree, Damien said calmly. It should not be. His answer somehow unsettled me even more than certainty would have. Anthony slid another photograph across the table. This one showed Damien as a young boy standing beside his grandmother outside the same greenhouse. Near the edge of the picture, barely visible, a small child chased butterflies across the grass. The image was blurred because she had been running. Only her white sun hat and round silhouette could be seen clearly. I stared at it for several long seconds. Something deep inside me tightened. Turn it over, Damien said quietly. Anthony flipped the photograph. Written in faded blue ink were 6 simple words. Summer Garden. Olivia. Age 4. My breath caught, so suddenly I forgot to inhale again. That is impossible, I whispered. My parents never mentioned this place. Damien remained composed, but his gray eyes had changed. They no longer held simple curiosity. They held responsibility. Neither coincidence nor memory explains this anymore. He carefully placed the photograph beside the bouquet of white orchids I had arranged earlier. The flowers seemed almost symbolic now, as though they had quietly connected 2 lives long before either of us recognized the pattern. I shook my head slowly. Even if that photograph really says my name, I still have my own life. My shop, my apartment, my customers. I cannot stay here chasing stories from 20 years ago. Damien respected the silence before answering. Then, in the calmest voice I had heard all evening, he said, I am not asking you to stay because of the past. I am asking because whoever placed you in that ballroom tonight already knows something about your future. I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to pick up my keys, climb into my aging delivery van, drive back across the Brooklyn Bridge, and wake up tomorrow believing this entire evening had been nothing more than an unforgettable misunderstanding. That was the sensible choice. It was the choice my parents would have expected me to make. I looked down at the faded photograph again. The little girl in the white sun hat was too blurry to identify, yet the handwritten name on the back seemed impossible to ignore. Olivia, age 4. I slowly pushed the photograph back across the table. I appreciate everything you have shown me, I said carefully, but I cannot rebuild my life around one old picture. Damien accepted my answer without the slightest sign of disappointment. I would be concerned if you did. That response caught me off guard. You are not going to argue? No. He folded his hands behind his back and glanced toward the rain-covered windows. Trust is never demanded. It is earned. For the first time that evening, I understood why people followed him so naturally. It was not because he raised his voice. It was because he never seemed threatened by someone else's independence. Anthony quietly closed the archive folder. Miss Carter, would you at least allow us to drive you home? I smiled politely and shook my head. Thank you, but my van is parked outside. It has survived New York traffic for 6 years. I think it can survive one more rainy night. Damien reached into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket and removed a simple white business card. There was no company logo, no impressive title, only his name and a phone number embossed in dark gray letters. He placed it gently on the table rather than handing it to me directly. If anything unusual happens, he said, call this number. Any hour. I looked at the card for a moment before slipping it into my jacket pocket. Hopefully nothing unusual happens for a very long time. A faint smile returned to his face. I hope you are right. 10 minutes later, I was back behind the wheel of my old delivery van. The engine protested before finally starting, just as it always did during cold weather. I laughed quietly to myself. Somehow hearing the familiar rattle of the dashboard felt comforting after spending the evening surrounded by marble floors, priceless artwork, and conversations that seemed to carry invisible consequences. Manhattan shimmered beneath the rain as I crossed the bridge toward Brooklyn. My windshield wipers moved back and forth with steady rhythm. I kept replaying every moment in my mind. The mysterious coordinator. The misplaced ring. The old greenhouse. The nickname Little Sparrow. None of it belonged in my ordinary life. By the time I unlocked the door to Carter Florals, it was nearly 11 o'clock. The familiar scent of lilies, roses, and damp soil wrapped around me like an old friend. Maple immediately appeared from behind the counter, letting out an unmistakable complaint about my late arrival before rubbing against my ankle. "I know," I whispered with a tired smile. "It has been a strange night." I filled her food bowl, switched on the warm display lights, and began checking tomorrow's flower orders. Routine usually calmed me. Numbers made sense. Customer names made sense. Delivery addresses made sense. My phone vibrated once inside my jacket. Expecting a supplier confirmation, I pulled it out. Instead, I found a message from an unknown number. There was no greeting, no signature, only one sentence. "Do not trust the story they are preparing to tell you." I frowned. Before I could decide whether to delete it, another message arrived. This one contained a single photograph. My hands froze above the screen. It showed my flower shop from across the street. The picture had been taken only minutes earlier because my lights were still on inside the store. I hurried toward the front window and carefully lifted one corner of the blinds. The sidewalk outside looked completely empty. Rain continued falling beneath the streetlights. Cars passed normally. Nobody appeared to be watching. Yet when I lowered my eyes back to the phone, a third message had already arrived. It contained only 6 words that made every tiny hair on my arm stand up. "Ask Damien about the olive tree." I read the final message 3 more times before I realized I had stopped breathing. "Ask Damien about the olive tree." That was all it said. No explanation. No signature. Just 6 words that somehow carried more weight than every unanswered question from the ballroom. Maple brushed against my leg again, reminding me that unlike mysterious text messages, cats still believe dinner should happen on schedule. I slipped the phone into my pocket, locked the front door, and checked the windows one more time. The street outside looked perfectly ordinary. A delivery truck rolled past the corner. A couple hurried beneath a shared umbrella. The coffee shop across the street was closing for the night. Nothing suggested that someone had taken a photograph of my flower shop only minutes earlier. I wanted to convince myself it was a prank, an impossible coincidence. Maybe one of my friends had somehow discovered where I had been that evening. But none of my friends knew Damien Moretti. None of them knew anything about an olive tree. Sleep refused to come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faded photograph from the gallery and heard the quiet certainty in Damien's voice. Trust is never demanded. It is earned. Around 6:30 the next morning, sunlight filtered through the apartment above my shop, painting soft golden lines across the wooden floor. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the entire neighborhood and opened the store an hour earlier than usual. Routine had always been my safest place. I trimmed fresh stems, replaced water buckets, arranged sunflowers near the entrance, and answered 2 customer emails about weekend weddings. For nearly an hour, I almost believed life had returned to normal. Then my phone rang. The screen displayed no name, only the number printed on the white business card Damien had given me. I stared at it until the 4th ring before finally answering. "Good morning," I said cautiously. "Miss Carter." His voice sounded exactly as calm as it had the night before. "I hope I am not interrupting your morning." I glanced around my empty shop. "You are not." A brief silence followed. "I have been thinking about our conversation," he said. "So have I." I reached into my apron pocket and touched the anonymous messages still saved on my phone. "There is something I need to ask you." "Go ahead." I took a slow breath. "What is the olive tree?" The silence on the other end lasted noticeably longer this time. When Damien finally spoke again, his voice had become quieter. "Who told you those words?" "I received anonymous messages last night." I explained the photograph, the warning, and the final sentence exactly as it had appeared. He never interrupted once. When I finished, I heard him exhale slowly. "Olivia," he said, "I need you to listen carefully. The olive tree was never public knowledge." "What does that mean?" "It was planted by my grandmother inside the greenhouse where the photograph was taken. She called it the family tree because every child born into our circle placed a small white ribbon on one branch during spring." I felt a chill despite the warm morning sunlight pouring through my front windows. "You are saying whoever sent that message knows your family, or knows someone who did?" I looked across the shop toward a framed picture of my parents smiling beside the original Carter Florals sign. My parents never mentioned any greenhouse. Perhaps they had a reason. Before I could respond, the small brass bell above my front door chimed. I looked up automatically, expecting a customer searching for fresh roses. Instead, an elderly woman stepped quietly inside carrying a worn canvas tote bag. Her white hair was tucked beneath a pale blue scarf, and her warm smile reminded me unexpectedly of the woman in Damien's photograph. She walked directly to the counter without looking at the flower displays. "You are Olivia," she said gently. I nodded. "Yes. Can I help you?" She reached into her bag and carefully placed a weathered ceramic flower pot onto the counter. Inside it grew a tiny olive sapling no taller than 12 inches. A single white ribbon was tied neatly around its slender trunk. Before I could ask where it had come from, the woman smiled with unmistakable affection and softly whispered, "Welcome home, little sparrow." The tiny olive sapling seemed far too small to carry the weight of everything that had happened during the past 12 hours. Yet I could not take my eyes off the white ribbon tied carefully around its slender trunk. The elderly woman rested both hands on the flower pot, as though she had protected it for a very long time. Damien remained silent on the phone, waiting for me to explain why I had suddenly stopped speaking. "Olivia," he asked gently, "are you still there?" I swallowed. "Someone just walked into my shop." The woman smiled kindly as if she already knew every word I was about to say. "She brought me an olive tree." I heard movement on Damien's end of the call. Not panic, not alarm, simply immediate attention. "Do not let her leave until I arrive. She does not seem dangerous," I whispered. The woman chuckled softly after hearing that. "Your grandmother used to say the same thing about me," she said. My heart skipped. "You knew his grandmother?" She nodded. "For almost 40 years. I carefully ended the call after telling Damien my address, then placed the phone face down on the counter. The shop suddenly felt much smaller than it had an hour earlier. Morning sunlight poured through the front windows, warming the rows of lilies and tulips, while the quiet hum of the floral cooler filled the silence between us. "Who are you?" I finally asked. The woman removed one gardening glove before extending her hand. "My name is Eleanor Brooks." I shook it carefully. Her hands were rough with the familiar texture of someone who had spent decades caring for living things. "You worked in the greenhouse," I guessed. Eleanor's eyes brightened with gentle surprise. "You remember more than you think." I frowned. "I do not remember you. Not with your mind." She touched one of the tiny olive leaves. "Sometimes memory begins with the heart." I looked again at the sapling. Something about its fresh, earthy scent stirred a feeling I could not explain. Not a clear memory. More like standing outside a familiar house after many years away. "My parents never told me about any of this," I whispered. Eleanor nodded with understanding instead of judgment. "Your parents loved you enough to protect the life they built for you." "Protect me from what?" Before she answered, the brass bell above the entrance chimed again. I looked up instinctively. Damien stepped inside wearing a charcoal overcoat over his black suit from the night before. Rain no longer covered the city, but tiny droplets still clung to his shoulders from the cool morning air. The dark tattoo patterns rose above his collar exactly as they had beneath the ballroom lights, disappearing beneath the fabric of his coat. Anthony followed a respectful distance behind carrying a slim leather folder. Damien's eyes immediately found the olive sapling on my counter. He slowed his pace. "It is real," he murmured almost to himself. Eleanor smiled warmly. "Just like the last one." Damien inclined his head politely toward her. "Mrs. Brooks. It has been too long, Damien." There was quiet affection between them, the kind built over many years rather than dramatic reunions. I looked back and forth between the three of them, feeling like the only person who had missed the first 20 chapters of a book everyone else had already read. "Would someone please explain what is happening?" Eleanor looked toward Damien before answering. He gave a slight nod. She reached into her canvas bag and carefully removed a weathered wooden box no larger than a recipe book. Time had softened the oak until it glowed honey brown beneath the morning light. A small olive branch had been carved into the lid by hand. "Your grandmother left this with me," Eleanor said quietly. "She told me to return it only if the little girl with the white ribbon ever found her way home." My breath caught as she placed the box gently beside the olive sapling. Damien did not touch it. Neither did Anthony. They both looked at me instead. I stared at the carved olive branch for several long seconds before slowly lifting the lid. Resting inside was a faded friendship bracelet woven from green and white thread, and without thinking, the first words that left my mouth were, "I made this for Damien when we were children." The words left my mouth before I had time to question them. I made this for Damien when we were children. The moment I spoke, another memory rushed forward with startling clarity. Warm afternoon sunlight poured through the glass roof of the greenhouse. I was sitting cross-legged on an old wooden bench with colorful threads tangled around my fingers while a quiet boy watched me with endless patience. He had laughed because I kept tying the knots too tightly. I had told him that if the bracelet was strong enough, he would never lose it. My knees almost gave out beneath me. I steadied myself against the counter as tears blurred the edges of the little woven bracelet resting inside the wooden box. Damien remained perfectly still, but I saw something soften behind his gray eyes for the first time since we had met. Eleanor gently closed the lid halfway before speaking. "Your parents never lied to you, Olivia. They simply protected the promise they made." I looked at her through unsteady breaths. "What promise?" "After your biological parents passed away unexpectedly, your adoptive parents were asked to raise you far away from the world your family had belonged to. They wanted you to grow up with ordinary birthdays, neighborhood friends, and the freedom to choose your own future instead of having one chosen for you." I slowly lowered myself into the chair behind the counter, trying to absorb years of hidden history all at once. I thought about every school recital my parents had attended, every birthday cake they had baked, every encouraging smile when I dreamed of opening a flower shop. None of those memories felt false. If anything, they felt even more precious now. Damien quietly stepped closer, leaving the same respectful distance he always had. "They gave you something very few people receive," he said. "A life that truly belonged to you." I looked up at him. "And now," he glanced toward the tiny olive sapling before answering, "now the choice still belongs to you." Those words settled over my heart more gently than I expected. He did not ask me to become part of his world. He did not ask me to wear the family ring. He simply returned something that had been taken from me long ago, the ability to choose. Anthony opened the leather folder he had been carrying and placed several official documents on the counter. "These are copies of records Mrs. Brooks preserved for more than 2 decades. They belong to you whenever you are ready." I rested my hand lightly on the folder, but did not open it. There would be time for names, dates, and signatures later. Right now, I wanted to remember the people who had loved me enough to let me live an ordinary life. I walked toward the front window of the flower shop. Outside, the rain had completely disappeared. Sunlight reflected from the sidewalks, and people hurried through Brooklyn carrying groceries, coffee cups, and bouquets for birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet apologies. The world had not changed overnight. Only my understanding of it had. I turned back toward Damien. "There is something I need to say." He waited without speaking. "The ring belonged to the wrong moment, not the wrong woman." A faint smile appeared across his face. "I was hoping you might say something like that." I laughed softly. "Do not misunderstand me." I pointed toward the wooden box and then toward the flower displays surrounding us. "I am still the owner of Carter Florals. I still have customers waiting for centerpieces, invoices that need to be paid, and a cat who believes she owns this building." Even Anthony smiled at that. Damien inclined his head with quiet respect. "Then that is exactly who you should remain." He reached into his pocket and removed the platinum ring once more. Instead of offering it to me, he placed it carefully inside the wooden box beside the friendship bracelet before gently closing the lid. "Some things are worth waiting for," he said. I looked at the closed box, then at the tiny olive tree growing beside it. The mystery that had begun with a mistaken proposal had not ended with a grand declaration. It had ended with something far more valuable: freedom, trust, and the chance to decide my own future. As Damien walked toward the door, he paused beneath the little brass bell and looked back one final time. He had spent years building an empire powerful enough to command a city, yet the greatest victory of his life came when he finally understood that love could never be claimed by authority. It could only be accepted as a gift. And that morning, surrounded by flowers, sunlight, and the quiet promise of new beginnings, I realized that the strongest hands are not the ones that hold on the tightest. They are the ones that know exactly when to let someone choose their own way home.